A single door, one door, set into the side of a vessel so vast that a man standing at its bow could not see the faces of those standing at its stern. One door, and when the last foot crossed that threshold, God himself reached down and sealed it shut. Not Noah, not his sons. God. The hand that separated light from darkness now closed a door, and the world split in two, those inside, and everything else. To understand what that door held back, and what that vessel truly was, you have to forget almost everything you think you know. Forget the children's book. Forget the cartoon boat with the giraffe's head poking cheerfully from a window. What Scripture describes is not a charming houseboat. It is an engineering marvel of such precise proportion that modern naval architects, when they finally tested its design in wave tanks and computer simulations, stepped back from their data and did not know what to say. Because the numbers worked. The numbers worked perfectly. The dimensions are given in Genesis 6:15, with the kind of specificity you find in a blueprint, not a myth. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Using the standard ancient cubit of 17.5 inches, that yields a vessel roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. If the Royal Egyptian cubit was intended, 20.5 inches, the vessel stretches past 500 feet. Either way, you are looking at the largest wooden vessel described anywhere in the ancient world. And to feel what that means, stand in your mind at one end and look down its length. You are looking at something longer than a football field and a half, something wider than a 6-lane highway, something as tall as a 4-story building, and that is just what rises above the waterline. The displacement, the sheer weight of water it would push aside, comes to approximately 22,000 tons. That is half the displacement of the Titanic, half the Titanic, built from wood, in the ancient world, from dimensions given in a single verse of Scripture. But here is the thing most people walk right past, and it changes everything about how you understand this vessel. The Hebrew word for Noah's Ark is not the word for a ship. It is not onaya, the standard Hebrew term for a sea-going vessel. The word is tebah, and tebah does not mean ship. It means a box, a chest, a container. It appears exactly twice in the entire Bible. Here, for Noah's Ark, and 900 years later in Exodus chapter 2, verse 3, for the tiny basket that a desperate mother waterproofed with pitch and set among the reeds of the Nile to save her infant son. Moses. The same rare word, tebah, spans nearly a millennium and links two acts of salvation by water: a chest that saved humanity, a basket that saved the deliverer of a nation, both sealed with pitch, both entrusted to the current, both holding life inside while death moved all around them. That is not coincidence. That is design written into the vocabulary of Scripture like a watermark you can only see when you hold the page to the light. And if that connection makes the hair rise on the back of your neck, wait, because the pitch itself carries a message. Genesis 6:14 says, God commanded Noah to coat the ark inside and out with gopher. The word means pitch, bitumen, the thick black waterproofing material that has oozed from natural seeps along the Euphrates River at a place called Hit in modern Iraq for at least 5,000 years. Herodotus, the Greek historian, described that same bitumen being hauled down the river to mortar the great walls of Babylon. It was commercially traded, it was abundant, it was real. But the word gopher is also the Hebrew root that gives us kafar, to cover, to make atonement. It is the same root behind Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. When God told Noah to cover the ark with pitch, the Hebrew ear heard something else underneath the construction order. Cover it with covering, atone it with atonement, seal it with the same word that would one day describe the blood on the mercy seat. The vessel that saved the world was literally atoned before the concept of atonement had a name. Now walk with me into the construction itself, because what Genesis describes is not vague. It is specific in ways that reward close attention. 3 decks, lower, second, and third. A single door in the side, and at the top a tzohar, finished to 1 cubit from the upper edge. That word, tzohar, is related to the Hebrew word for noon, for brilliance, for the blinding light of midday. Most scholars read it as a roof opening or window running along the top of the vessel, a clear story that would allow light and ventilation while keeping rain out. But the ancient rabbis, in Genesis Rabbah 31:11, imagined something stranger and more beautiful. They said that Tzohar was a luminous stone, a crystal that gathered light and radiated it through the interior darkness. We cannot know which reading is correct, but both carry the same truth. Even in the vessel built for the destruction of the world, God made provision for light. He did not send his people into darkness without a window toward heaven. Take those 3 decks and calculate the floor space. The math is straightforward, and the result is staggering. Approximately 101,250 square feet of total deck area. That is slightly more than 20 standard basketball courts laid side by side. The total cargo volume reaches 1.5 million cubic feet, equivalent to roughly 522 standard railroad stock cars. And this is where the common objection collapses, the one that lives in the back of so many minds. How could all those animals possibly fit? In 1996, a taxonomist named John Woodmarap published the most rigorous quantitative study ever attempted on this question. He worked at the genus level, what Scripture calls kind, not the species level. You do not need every breed of dog. You need the dog kind. You do not need every variety of finch. You need the finch kind. His conclusion, approximately 16,000 animals. And here is the detail that demolishes the mental image most people carry. The image of elephants and giraffes crammed shoulder to shoulder in a groaning wooden hull. The median animal size in Woodmarap's analysis was that of a small rat. The vast majority of animals on the Ark would have been small: insects, rodents, small birds, reptiles no bigger than your hand. The elephants and giraffes people imagine were the extreme exceptions, not the rule. And juvenile pairs of large animals, smaller, lighter, consuming less food, would have been the logical choice. 240 railroad stock cars could carry all 16,000 animals. The Ark had capacity for 522. More than half the vessel was empty. Space for food, space for water, space for the 8 human beings who carried the future of civilization in their exhausted hands. Woodmarap calculated the food requirements too. Roughly 6,700 tons of compressed hay and dried provisions for 1 year. That sounds enormous until you realize it occupies only about 15% of the remaining cargo space. The logistics work. They do not work barely, scraping by with no margin. They work with abundance. They work the way God tends to work, with more provision than the need requires. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the Ark was not a desperate improvisation. It was not Noah scrambling to build something barely adequate. The proportions, the capacity, the cargo margins, everything points to a vessel designed with the same terrifying precision as creation itself. The God who calibrated the distance between earth and sun to sustain life also calibrated the distance between keel and deck to sustain life through judgment. The signature is the same, and the proportions themselves testify. The length-to-width ratio of the Ark is 6:1. If that number means nothing to you, it means everything to a naval engineer. 6:1 is the optimal ratio for stability in heavy seas. It is the ratio used in modern cargo barges, vessels designed not for speed, but for staying upright under enormous loads in violent water. In 1993, Dr. S.W. Hong and a team at the Korea Research Institute of Ships and Ocean Engineering built scale models of the Ark and subjected them to simulated ocean conditions. Their finding, the Ark's proportions could handle waves up to 30 meters, nearly 100 feet, without capsizing. 30-meter waves, that is the height of a 10-story building of water crashing against your hull. And the design holds. Now compare that to the only other ancient vessel described in comparable detail. In 1872, a young British museum assistant named George Smith was translating a clay tablet from the ruins of Nineveh when his hands began to shake. He had found Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, and on it was a flood story. A god warning a man, a vessel, animals loaded aboard, a dove released to find land. The parallels to Genesis were unmistakable, but the vessel described in Gilgamesh is a perfect cube, 120 cubits on each side, 7 decks, and any first-year naval engineering student can tell you what happens to a cube in open water. It rolls uncontrollably, catastrophically. A cube has no directional stability. It would tumble its passengers and cargo into a churning mass with the first serious wave. The Gilgamesh vessel is a literary memory of a real event, distorted through centuries of retelling until the critical details, the details that make survival physically possible, were lost. The Genesis account preserved them, 6-1, 3 decks, elongated, stable, seaworthy. The text that people call myth reads like engineering. The text that scholars once preferred reads like fantasy. And the Ark had no rudder, no sail, no oars, no navigation system of any kind. This was not an oversight. This was the point. The tebba, the box, the chest, was designed for one purpose: to float, to endure, to keep its contents alive while the world outside was unmade. Direction belonged to God. Destination belonged to God. Noah's job was to build it, enter it, and trust the hand that sealed the door. Genesis 7:11 records the beginning with the precision of a captain's log. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The Hebrew phrase for what happened beneath the surface is kol ma yenot tehom rabba nivkeu. All the springs of the great deep were torn apart. And that word, tehom, the deep, is the same word used in Genesis 1:2 when the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the tehom before creation began. The flood was not merely a storm. It was a partial reversal of creation itself. The waters that God had gathered and separated on the 2nd and 3rd days of creation, the waters above and the waters below, were released back. The boundaries God set were opened. The world did not just flood, it uncreated. 40 days and 40 nights the rain fell. And that number, 40, enters Scripture here for the first time. But it will never leave. Moses will spend 40 days on Sinai receiving the law. The spies will search Canaan for 40 days. Elijah will walk 40 days to reach the mountain of God. Jesus will endure 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his ministry. The pattern of testing, of endurance, of divine proving begins here, in the rain that fell on the ark. And it threads through the entire biblical story like a rope that will not break. But the rain was only the beginning. The common assumption that the flood lasted 40 days is one of the most widespread misreadings in all of Scripture. Genesis 8:14 records that the earth was fully dry in the 2nd month on the 27th day of the following year. The total time aboard the ark was approximately 370 days, a full year of darkness and water and the sound of a world being unmade outside the only walls that held, and inside those walls a man whom Scripture describes with a single extraordinary word. Genesis 6:9 calls Noah Tamim, blameless, perfect. But tamim is not a word that belongs to moral philosophy. It belongs to the temple. It is the same word used in Leviticus 1:3 to describe a sacrificial animal without defect, the unblemished lamb required for an acceptable offering. Noah's righteousness is described in sacrificial language. He was, in the vocabulary of Scripture, a living offering, the one whose wholeness made him acceptable to stand in the gap between God's judgment and humanity's survival. And when the waters receded and the ark came to rest, and Noah finally stepped onto solid ground, the first thing he did was build an altar, the first altar mentioned in the Bible, and he took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and he offered burnt offerings. And Genesis 8:21 records that the Lord smelled the Reach Nikoach, the soothing aroma, the pleasing fragrance. That phrase, Reach Nikoach, becomes the technical language of sacrifice throughout Leviticus. Every time a priest in the tabernacle offers a burnt offering, and the text says God smelled the pleasing aroma, it echoes back to this moment, to Noah, to the first altar, to the first sacrifice after judgment. The entire sacrificial system of Israel carries the scent of Noah's gratitude. Tell me something in the comments. Has there ever been a moment in your life where you realized that something God did, something you thought was only about survival, was actually the beginning of something so much larger you could not see its edges? Because that is what is happening on that mountain in Ararat. Noah thinks he is giving thanks. He is. But he is also inaugurating the language of worship that will culminate 1,000 years later on a hill outside Jerusalem, where another unblemished offering will be made, not on an altar of stone, but on a cross of wood. And then God made a covenant, and the sign he chose tells you everything about who he is. Genesis 9:13, I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The Hebrew word is keshet, and keshet does not mean rainbow. It means a war bow, the weapon of a warrior. God is taking the instrument of his judgment, the bow he aimed at the earth, and hanging it in the sky, pointing it away from the earth, pointing it toward heaven, toward himself. The warrior is disarming, the judge is binding his own hands, and every time you see a rainbow after a storm, you are looking at a weapon that has been turned into a promise. You are looking at God's unilateral decision to absorb the cost of mercy rather than release the full measure of justice. The bow of wrath, hung in the sky as a sign of peace. I need you to understand something about the animals, because there is a detail here that scholars have debated for generations, and it deserves to be heard. Genesis 7:2 tells Noah to take 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of every unclean animal, clean and unclean. But the law of Moses, the Torah, with its elaborate dietary code distinguishing clean from unclean, would not be given for another 900 years. Noah knew the categories. He knew which animals were acceptable for sacrifice and which were not. This means the distinction between clean and unclean did not originate at Sinai. It is older, far older. It reaches back before the flood, before the corruption of the earth, into a body of divine instruction so ancient that its origins disappear into the mist of the earliest human memory. God was teaching his people what holiness looked like long before he wrote it on stone. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The Hebrew uses the plural, hairy Ararat, indicating not a single peak, but a range. The ancient kingdom of Urartu stretched across what is now eastern Turkey, Armenia, and the borderlands of Iran. Mount Ararat itself, Agri-Dagi, rises to over 17,000 feet, a volcanic sentinel permanently capped in snow and ice. Whether the ark rested on that specific mountain or elsewhere in the range, Scripture does not say. But the region itself carries a quiet confirmation that the ancient rabbis would have appreciated. Genesis 9:20 records that after the flood, Noah planted a vineyard. He became, the text says plainly, a man of the soil. And it was there in the region of Ararat that he made wine and drank and was overcome. The region of eastern Turkey, Armenia, and Georgia is precisely where modern archaeobotanists have identified the oldest evidence of viticulture on Earth. The Arini I cave in Armenia yielded the remains of the world's oldest known winery, dating to approximately 4,100 years before Christ. The man, Scripture says, planted the first vineyard after the flood did so in exactly the region where the archaeological record says vineyards first appeared. The text and the soil agree. The ancient world remembered the flood, not in one tradition, in dozens. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, reported in his Antiquities of the Jews that remains of the ark were still shown in Armenia in his own lifetime, and that writers from multiple cultures, Berossus the Chaldean, Hieronymus the Egyptian, Nicholas of Damascus, all mentioned them. Berossus, a Babylonian priest of the 3rd century before Christ, recorded in his Babyloniaca that a man named Xisuthros was warned by the god Kronos to build a vessel, that the vessel landed in Armenia after a great flood, and that people in his own day scraped pitch from the remains and carried it as protective amulets. The Sumerians preserved the story of Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis. The Babylonians told it through Atrahasis. At least 6 ancient Near Eastern cultures preserved independent flood memories with strikingly parallel elements: divine warning, vessel construction, animal loading, landing on a mountain, a sacrifice afterward. The memory was everywhere, because the water had been everywhere. And then there are the birds, 3 sendings. The first, a raven, Genesis 8:7 says, "It went out Yatzov-Vashov, going and returning in continuous flight, likely feeding on what floated on the surface of a drowned world." Then, the dove. 3 times Noah released it. The first time it returned with nothing, no place to land, the earth still submerged. The second time it came back in the evening with a single olive leaf in its beak. The Hebrew is precise, ale zayit taraf, a freshly plucked leaf, not a dead branch carried by receding water, a living leaf torn from a living tree. Somewhere beneath the floodwaters, an olive tree had survived. Life was returning. The third time the dove did not come back at all. It had found a world worth staying in. A freshly plucked leaf carried in the beak of a bird, delivered to the hand of a man who had waited a year inside a wooden box sealed by the hand of God. That leaf was the first evidence that death had not won. That leaf was resurrection before resurrection had a name. When you think of the ark, I want you to stop seeing a boat, see a coffin that floated, see a sealed chest like the Ark of the Covenant that would come later, another box overlaid with God's presence, another container holding the terms of survival for an entire people. See a baptismal font, because that is what the Apostle Peter saw. In his first letter, chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, Peter writes that 8 souls were saved through water, and he draws a direct line from the flood to baptism. The water that destroyed the world simultaneously lifted the ark. The same substance was judgment and salvation at the same moment, depending on where you stood, inside the Tabor or outside it, inside the covering or exposed, inside the atonement or beyond it. That is the architecture of grace, not the removal of danger, but the provision of refuge inside it. Noah lived to be 950 years old. He was the last of the ancient patriarchs with those staggering lifespans. His son Shem lived only 600 years. Within 10 generations, Abraham would live to 175. Something changed after the flood. The world that emerged from the water was not the world that had entered it. The long lives shortened. The conditions shifted, But the covenant held, the bow stayed in the sky, and a vessel made of gopher wood, that mysterious Hapax legomenon, that word used exactly once in all of Scripture, never identified with certainty, debated for centuries. Cypress? Cedar? A resinous conifer lost to taxonomy. That vessel carried inside its pitched and atoned walls not just animals and grain and 8 trembling human beings. It carried the entire future, every nation, every language, every child ever born after the waters receded descends from the people who walked through that single door in the side of a wooden chest and heard God seal it behind them. One door, set in the side, and centuries later, on a Friday afternoon, a Roman soldier would thrust a spear into the side of another body, and from that wound would flow the water and the blood that opened another door. The only door, the door through which all who enter are saved from a judgment they cannot survive alone. If you are listening to this, and you feel something stirring in your chest, something heavy and warm, and almost too large for your ribs to contain, I want you to know that this is not nostalgia. This is recognition. You are recognizing the handwriting of the God who writes the same word across millennia. Tabor, a box that saves. Kopher, a covering that atones. Tamim, an unblemished offering that stands between wrath and mercy. These words were placed in Genesis so that when you finally encountered the cross, you would see that it was not an improvisation. It was not Plan B. It was the Ark. It was always the Ark. A wooden structure, sealed with sacrifice, entered through a single door, carrying everyone who trusted it through the waters of death into a world made new. Noah did not steer the Ark. He could not see where it was going. He had no rudder, no sail, no map, no stars to navigate by, just the sound of water against wood and the promise of a God who closes doors. And that is where some of you are right now. Inside something you did not design, riding out something you cannot control, unable to see land in any direction. The water is real, the darkness is real, the waiting is unbearable, but the vessel holds. It was built to hold. Its proportions were calculated by the same mind that calculated the distance between stars, and it does not capsize in 30-meter waves. It does not capsize in yours. The light comes in through the tsohar, that window at the top, that opening toward brilliance, not a window on the side where all you would see is water and ruin, a window above. The only direction worth looking when the world is flooded is up. I hope this story stays with you, not as information but as presence. The presence of a God who warned before he judged, who provided before he destroyed, who sealed the door himself because he would not trust the most important closure in history to human hands. The God who hung his war bow in the sky and said, "Never again." Not because humanity would improve, but because his mercy is not contingent on our performance. It is contingent on his character, and his character does not change. If this moved you, if you want to continue walking through these ancient texts and discovering what has been hidden in plain sight for millennia, subscribe and walk with us. There is so much more to find. The wood and pitch of Genesis carry forward into the wood and nails of Calvary, and the story does not end at the empty tomb any more than it ended on the mountains of Ararat. It continues. It continues in you. It continues in everyone who hears the rain falling and chooses to step through the one door that God himself holds open, and trust the hand that seals it shut behind them.